It was supposed to be a quick detour, just a wrong turn that no one would remember. But one streetlight turned off, and suddenly the world as Amanda knew it crumbled into something unrecognizable. Amanda Matthews gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white as dusk descended into a murky evening. The city skyline, which she could once see glinting in her rearview mirror, was now hidden behind rows of rundown houses and sagging telephone poles. Her heart raced as she scanned the GPS, silently cursing at its uselessness. "Rerouting," it said for the fourth time, and now it was too late. She was far from the highway, the street names no longer familiar. The faces, barely visible in the dim glow of street lamps, stared as her pristine white SUV crawled through the cracked, narrow roads. The neighborhood was a far cry from the polished suburbs Amanda was used to. Buildings were tagged with graffiti, their windows boarded up, and trash littered the streets. She could see people, some leaning on porch railings, others sitting on crumbling steps. Their eyes followed her, suspicion mixed with curiosity. Her fingers shook as she locked the doors. A pit of dread formed in her stomach. Amanda had lived her whole life in comfort, sheltered by the affluent bubble of Cedar Oaks, an upper-class, predominantly white neighborhood in the northern part of the city. For her, the wrong side of town was just a cautionary tale, a story whispered at dinner parties and PTA meetings. She never expected to find herself here, lost in the heart of it. Her eyes flicked to the gas gauge, nearly empty. Panic surged through her chest. How long had she been driving aimlessly? She couldn't be stuck here, not in a place like this. "This isn't safe," she muttered, fighting back tears. She needed to get out, now. As she turned a corner, the street narrowed further, the houses crammed closer together. The pavement beneath her car was riddled with potholes, forcing her to slow down even more. Just then, her car gave a final sputter and lurched to a stop. The gas tank had hit empty. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She was alone, stuck, and there was no way out. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her husband's number. No service. Of course there was no service. She tried again, but the signal was dead. Tears burned the back of her eyes as she let out a shaky breath. "Okay, okay," she whispered to herself. "I'll just walk. I'll find a gas station or something." But the street was deserted now, as if the neighborhood had retreated into itself, waiting for the darkness to swallow her whole. Amanda glanced around nervously, pulling her coat tighter around her body as if it could protect her from the unease creeping up her spine. Just then, a shadow moved at the end of the street. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, stepped into view, walking slowly toward her. Amanda's heart raced. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stay inside the car, to lock the doors, and wait. But there was no gas, no phone signal, no time. She grabbed her purse and shoved open the door, stepping out into the cold night air. Her heels clicked against the cracked pavement, the sound echoing down the empty street. The figure drew closer. She could see him now, a man in his 30s, wearing a faded hoodie and jeans. His face was shadowed by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Hey, miss," he called out, his voice deep, unfamiliar. "You lost?" Amanda froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't know how to respond. Should she ask for help? Could she trust him? Every warning she'd ever heard about this part of town echoed in her mind. I'm fine," she stammered, stepping backward toward her car. "Just waiting for someone." The man stopped, tilting his head. "Doesn't look like you're fine," he said calmly. "Your car's out of gas." Amanda swallowed hard. "I'll be fine," she repeated, though her voice trembled. The man looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But you won't find a gas station for miles around here. I can help you if you want." He pointed toward a narrow alleyway to the left. "There's a garage a couple streets down. Old man Ray runs it. He can get you some gas." Amanda hesitated. Every instinct told her not to follow him. But what choice did she have? Her car was stranded, and she didn't know this place. She glanced at the alleyway, then back at the man. Something in his eyes was steady, not threatening. Against her better judgment, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lead the way." They walked in silence, the sounds of the city fading behind them as they turned down the narrow alley. Amanda's heart was still racing, but she forced herself to keep moving. As they reached the end of the alley, a small garage came into view. The sign above it was faded, the letters barely legible. The man walked up to the door and knocked twice. Moments later, an older man with graying hair and a worn face appeared. His eyes flicked from the stranger to Amanda, a frown creasing his brow. "Another one lost?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. The younger man nodded. "She needs gas. Think you can help her out, Ray?" Ray glanced at Amanda, then sighed. "Come on in. I'll see what I can do." Amanda stepped inside the garage, the warmth from the small heater in the corner hitting her like a wave. She wrapped her coat tighter around her, feeling out of place in the cluttered room. Old tools hung on the walls, and a half-finished car sat on the lift in the corner. Ray disappeared into the back room, leaving Amanda alone with the stranger. She glanced at him nervously, unsure of what to say. "I'm Michael," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. "Amanda?" she replied, her voice soft. "You don't look like you're from around here," Michael said, a hint of amusement in his tone. Amanda let out a nervous laugh. "No, I'm not. I just got lost." Michael nodded. "Happens more often than you'd think. People like you don't usually come down here." Amanda stiffened at his words, her defenses rising. "People like me?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Michael raised an eyebrow. "I mean, people from the other side of town. This place isn't exactly on your map, is it?" She couldn't argue with that. "No," she admitted. "It's not." They fell into an awkward silence, the weight of unspoken assumptions hanging between them. Amanda glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a photo pinned to the wall. It was of a young boy, no more than 12, smiling brightly as he held up a trophy. The sight of his face tugged at something deep inside her. "Is that your son?" she asked, nodding toward the photo. Michael's expression softened, a shadow passing over his face. "Yeah, that's TJ. He looks like a good kid," Amanda said, her voice gentle. Michael smiled faintly, but there was pain in his eyes. "He was..." The word hit Amanda like a punch to the gut. Was. She didn't have to ask what had happened. She could see it in Michael's face, in the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of the memory. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. Michael nodded, his gaze distant. "It's just how things are around here," he said quietly. "Kids like TJ don't make it out. Not alive, anyway." The truth of his words settled over Amanda like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. She had lived her whole life believing that places like this were just stories, that the violence and struggles were distant, abstract problems. But here it was, standing right in front of her, in the form of a grieving father. I didn't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," Michael said, his tone resigned. "You wouldn't." Ray returned then, holding a small gas can. "This should get you back to a station," he said, handing it to Amanda. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She turned to Michael. "Thank you for helping me." Michael shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Just be careful next time," he said. "This place isn't kind to outsiders." Amanda nodded, her throat tight as she turned to leave. As she walked back to her car, the weight of everything she had seen and heard pressed down on her. This place, this forgotten neighborhood on the wrong side of town, was not just a place on the map. It was a place filled with people, with stories, with pain. And for the first time in her life, Amanda understood that. The SUV rumbled to life as she turned the key, the gas can now empty in the back seat. As she drove away, the neighborhood fading into the distance behind her, Amanda knew that she would never look at the world the same way again. As Amanda continued down the road, the city's skyline loomed closer, but her mind was still with Michael and the haunting loss he carried. She glanced at the gas gauge. It was barely moving, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had left something behind, something essential. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, heart racing, half expecting bad news. It was a message from her husband, a simple, "Where are you?" She quickly replied, letting him know she was on her way home. But her thoughts kept drifting back to that neighborhood, the faces she had seen, the grief that hung heavy in the air. She felt an overwhelming urge to return, to understand more, to connect with those lives that seemed so distant from her own. After a restless night, Amanda couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The next morning she found herself driving back to the neighborhood, this time with a determination that replaced her earlier fear. She parked her car a few blocks from the garage and walked toward the heart of the community. As she walked the streets, she noticed more than she had before. Children playing, women chatting, laughter spilling into the air. But there was an underlying tension, too, a current of worry that seemed to weave through conversations and linger in the shadows. She spotted Michael sitting on a stoop, the same spot she had seen him the previous night. He looked up as she approached, surprise flitting across his features. "What are you doing back here?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I wanted to talk," she said, feeling bolder now. "I wanted to understand." Michael studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You sure about that?" "I am," she replied. "I realized I can't just drive past and ignore what's happening here." "All right then," he said, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Let's talk." They found a quiet corner in the community park, sitting on a bench that creaked under their weight. As they spoke, Amanda learned more about Michael's life. He was a single father, struggling to make ends meet since the death of his son. The neighborhood, once vibrant and full of hope, had turned into a place where dreams went to die. Gangs, drugs, and violence had taken hold, and every day was a battle for survival. "I tried to keep TJ safe," Michael confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "But you can't shield them from everything. Sometimes you just run out of options." Amanda listened, her heart aching for the pain he carried. She realized how much she had taken for granted, the safety of her own home, the privilege of choice. As they talked, she felt a deepening connection with Michael, an understanding that transcended their differences. But their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion from across the park. A group of teenagers erupted into shouting, anger bubbling over as they confronted one another. "Get back!" one of them yelled, fists clenched. Michael stood up, his body tense. "This isn't good," he muttered, moving toward the chaos. Before Amanda could protest, he was already weaving through the crowd. She hesitated, but followed, the urgency of the moment propelling her forward. As they neared, she could see two boys, faces twisted in rage, pushing against one another. The threat of violence crackled in the air. "Hey, hey, stop it!" Michael shouted, stepping in between them. "This isn't the way!" But the boys were too caught up in their anger, their words a mix of accusations and hurt. Amanda felt her heart race as the situation escalated, fists flying, shouts echoing through the park. Suddenly, one of the boys pulled out a knife. Time slowed as Amanda gasped, the sight sending shockwaves through her. Michael lunged forward, his body instinctively shielding the younger boy, trying to defuse the situation. "Put it down! This isn't worth it!" he yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. Amanda's mind raced, the fear of violence crashing over her like a wave. The tension was palpable, every heartbeat drumming in her ears. She had never witnessed anything like this before. The rawness of anger, the potential for tragedy. In that moment, she understood what Michael meant about the reality of their lives. This was a daily struggle, one she had only observed from afar. She felt a surge of empathy, mingled with fear, and the realization that she wanted to help. Just then, a siren wailed in the distance and the boys began to scatter, the threat of authority breaking the tension. Michael remained where he was, breathing heavily, watching the chaos unfold. "You okay?" Amanda asked, stepping closer. He nodded, but the worry etched on his face told a different story. "It's always like this," he said, his voice shaking. "Every single day." They stood in silence, the echoes of anger fading into the distance. Amanda's heart ached for the community, for Michael, for the children who grew up in this turmoil. She realized that her earlier assumptions had blinded her to the struggles faced by people like him. As they left the park, Amanda felt a sense of purpose igniting within her. She wanted to make a difference, to connect with the community in a way that mattered. "Can I help?" she asked Michael, her voice steady. "I don't know how, but I want to do something." Michael looked at her, surprise flickering across his features. "You really want to help?" "I do," she said, determination filling her heart. "I can't just walk away anymore." Michael studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right. We could use all the help we can get." Weeks passed, and Amanda found herself becoming a part of the community she had once viewed from a distance. She organized food drives, helped with after-school programs, and worked with Michael to create a safe space for the children. As she immersed herself in their lives, she met families who shared their stories of loss, hope, and resilience. With every interaction, she shattered her own prejudices, recognizing the strength in the faces she had once found intimidating. But the challenges were far from over. One evening, as she was leaving the community center, Amanda received a call from Michael, his voice laced with urgency. "Amanda, you need to come. It's TJ. It's bad." Her heart dropped as she rushed to the neighborhood, dread flooding her senses. When she arrived, the scene was chaos. Police cars, flashing lights, and a gathering crowd. She pushed her way through, fear gripping her. Michael was standing there, his face pale, eyes filled with anguish. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. "TJ was in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, his voice breaking. "He got caught in the crossfire. He didn't make it." The world around Amanda blurred as Michael's words sank in. The tragedy felt unbearable, a weight pressing down on her chest. She reached for him, wrapping her arms around him as he trembled. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The pain radiating from him was palpable, a wound that cut deeper than anything she had ever known. The next few days were a blur of mourning, anger, and confusion. Amanda stood beside Michael, witnessing the raw grief that engulfed him. They held a vigil for TJ, a gathering of friends and family, stories shared in hushed tones, laughter mingling with tears. As she looked at the faces surrounding her, the pain etched into their features, the shared sense of loss, Amanda felt a surge of determination. This couldn't be the end. She needed to honor TJ's memory, to fight against the violence that had taken him away. In the following months, Amanda poured her energy into advocacy, rallying the community for change. They organized marches, spoke out against gun violence, and reached out to local leaders. The fight was daunting, but she found strength in the people around her. Michael became her closest ally, their bond forged through shared grief and hope. Together they worked tirelessly, turning their pain into purpose. As they shared their stories, they found others willing to join the fight. Mothers, fathers, teachers, and youth, all coming together to demand change. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way. But every small victory reignited their hope, pushing them forward. Amanda learned that change was a long road, filled with challenges and heartaches, but they were no longer alone. One evening, as she stood outside the community center, looking at the faces of children playing nearby, Amanda felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had stepped into the unknown, confronted her own biases, and emerged stronger for it. The wrong side of town had become a part of her, a place filled with life, stories, and resilience. And she knew, deep down, that she would continue fighting for a better future, not just for TJ, but for all the children who deserved a chance at a life free from fear. As the sun set on the neighborhood, casting warm hues over the buildings, Amanda felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would not shy away from the struggles of others anymore. Instead, she would stand with them, fighting for the change that was so desperately needed. In the end, Amanda discovered that sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you need to be.